When it comes to addressing racism in America, it's once again feeling like one step forward, 12 steps back. Because alongside Juneteenth commemorations across the country on its second year as a federal holiday, we have stories like this one out of Maine, where an insurance agency posted a sign to mark the day telling people to enjoy your fried chicken and collard greens. And Fox News using the holiday to urge people to fight anti-racist curriculum in schools. And then yesterday, we were once again reminded of the deep-rooted racism of the people who led this nation just a short time ago. The former president and his henchmen who targeted a mother-daughter pair of election volunteers, lying to the world about how they brought in thousands of fraudulent ballots to swing the election, and describing them like this.
She's a vote scammer, a professional vote scammer and hustler.
Of Ruby Freeman and Shay Freeman Moss and one other gentleman, quite obviously surreptitiously passing around USB ports as if they're vials of heroin or cocaine.
Lucky it was 2020 and not 1920, one Trump follower message. Oh, and what were they passing around, by the way? A ginger mint. So how do we combat racism coming at us from so many different angles? Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, is now the author of How to Raise an Anti-Racist. He's also the founding director of the BU Center for Anti-Racist Research. Joins me now. Dr. Kendi, it's good to see you. Thanks for your time.
Of course. Thank you for having me on.
Let me read to you from the end of the introduction to your book, right at the end there. The most critical part of raising an anti-racist child is not what we do with our child, it's what we do with our society. As I mentioned yesterday, we were treated to this vile, sadistic racism directed at two people from the former president of the United States. So it seems society is not doing so well, is it?
Certainly, and in many ways, it's not, and particularly because our children are watching. And our children are studying to see how we're treating different people, or in the case of those two people who testified before the January 6th, committee, how we're mistreating people, and by who we're mistreating, we're also demonstrating to children who we value or don't value, and almost opening the door for that mistreatment to continue for another generation.
So what do you say to that 12-year-old kid that was watching yesterday and says, why do tens of millions of people support a man who believes racial degradation is part of his way of doing business? Oh, no, by the way, that guy was the president of the United States. What do you say to that kid?
I say to that kid that you have many Americans who are struggling to make ends meet, who are struggling socially or personally, and they have been told by people who they trust, namely people like this president, that the source of their pain are people who don't look like them, who don't know them. And it's an easy way out, when in reality, that person is convincing them that the source of their pain are those other people, because typically that person themselves is a source of their pain. So it's a form of distraction.
You know, one of the most appealing parts of your books is you go out of your way to point out your own flaws. I'll tell you, I'm not telling anybody my flaws about anything. You mentioned that your original instinct was to shield your daughter, Amani, from racism. What changed your approach to child rearing?
I think it was a combination of experience, as a father, as well as conducting research, on this topic. And I thought that the way that I protected my daughter from racism was to almost keep her as far away from it as possible. But the more I studied and sort of experienced fatherhood, the more I realized there was no protecting her from it. There's only teaching her how to protect herself. And in the way we teach our children to look both ways, because we assume that at some point they're going to be crossing the street by themselves, and we don't want them to be hit, in this case, by these degrading messages that they're either better or worse because of the color of their skin.
When you were a kid, my understanding, you went to a bunch of different schools, is that right?
Yes, I think about 8 schools.
Why? Why'd you go to 8 different schools?
It was oftentimes because of experiencing racism at the particular school, and my parents deciding to find another place that they hoped that would sort of nurture me as opposed to ridicule me.
When you were all of 5 years old, I think you were in kindergarten, you write that you were found to be an unruly child. Were you?
Well, according to my mother, who came to actually observe me in the class, what was actually happening was there were multiple developmental levels in the classroom, and the teacher wasn't able to manage all these different students. And she would give some students like me assignments and expect me to just sit at my desk when I finished, and other students too. And then when we decided not to at 5 years old, particularly me, I was seen as a behavioral problem, as opposed to the way the classroom was structured.
So decades later, the same sort of thing with black kids in public schools today, black doctors, black teachers, black cops, and that sort of thing. How did that moment as a 5-year-old affect you? Does it stay with you?
I think the way it actually affected me most was when my daughter Imani went to school, or big school as she called it. I was actually personally, scared about her entrance into school, and many Black parents who have memories of how they were treated when they were first entering school have these fears, and so I was very hesitant to I was sort of scared about putting her in this environment where she is going to be looked upon as a behavioral problem or not given the benefit of the doubt because of her skin color by too many people.
Speaking of your daughter, you write about her, I believe, in daycare. You come to pick her up. She's playing with a blue-eyed white doll. Your wife does it the next day, blue-eyed white doll, on, blue-eyed white doll. And that leads you to describe something called the doll test. Tell us what the doll test is and who Mamie Phipps was.
So Mamie Phipps, as well as her husband, Kenneth Clark, in the early 1940s, they tested Black elementary school students in Massachusetts, as well as in the Deep South, and assessed whether they had a preference for white dolls or Black-looking dolls. And most of these Black children preferred a white doll. And actually, recently, another psychologist did a similar study and found that both Black and white children tend to prefer a white doll, which is called white bias. And that's one of the reasons why in my book, How to Raise an Anti-Racist, I'm encouraging parents and teachers to realize that we have to actively ensure that our kids are not attaching negativity or positivity to skin color. We just can't assume that if we don't encourage them to recognize racial equality, that they're going to believe it or see that for themselves.
Yeah, this may be obvious, but you mentioned, well, not the facts, but the impact. You mentioned that there were Black dolls for the first time, I think, in the late 60s. You mentioned even Barbie and her boyfriend diversifying in a whole bunch of ways much later, I think in the early part of the 21st century. I assume there's concrete data that shows that those changes lead to dramatic perception changes about the world. Is there not?
Well, and not only diversifying our toolbox can ensure that our kids are seeing the entirety of the human rainbow, but diversifying our libraries, diversifying our communities, even diversifying our friends has shown to have an impact on the racial attitudes of our children. So there's so many nonverbal choices that we make as teachers and parents that actually affect the racial attitudes of children, particularly young children. And oftentimes those nonverbal choices, like whether we're diversifying a toolbox, actually has more impact or is more influential in the racial attitudes of young children than even what we say or even don't say about race.
I'm sure you're watching the Ketanji Brown Jackson confirmation hearings, but I'm equally sure you were surprised to see Senator Cruz from Texas holding up one of your books when he was holding up a bunch of books that he considered to be objectionable, your book in particular, Anti-Racist Baby. Here's part of what Cruz had to say and a pretty powerful part of the response from now Justice Jackson.
Do you agree with this book that is being taught with kids that babies are racist?
Senator,
Boy, that sigh and that pause were pretty powerful stuff. Well, the good news, and I guess there's good news and bad news, what happened to your book sales after Cruz held up your book?
A few people got the book.
Not a few
But
people, exploded, right? But what's your reaction when you see a national stage like that? Or you read about another school district that says Kendi's books can't be there because they teach young kids that have white kids that have negative thoughts about themselves. How do you react to that?
I think it's tragic, and because it's just as Senator Cruz distorted the book and then attacked his own distortion, so too is a distortion that my books teach white children anything other that they should see themselves as equals to people who have a different skin color, and that's really that's one of the main messages my books are conveying. It conveys to kids of color that there's nothing wrong with you because of the color of your skin. And these books convey to white children that they're special when they're nice and they're special when they share, but they're not special because of their skin color. I think those are the messages we should be teaching our children so that they can view and recognize racial equality.
I'm on an eternal search for hope. And when you were here last time, I asked you, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, how can you be hopeful? And you said something like, well, the abolitionists said we're going to get rid of slavery. Everybody thought they were crazy. And now, if for those of us believe we can create an anti-racist society, and it's obvious from there. Well, since I saw you last, white supremacy is on the rise. Voter suppression laws are on the rise. Efforts at police reform have stalled. Are you still embracing this spirit of hope?
Well, yeah, and indeed, of course, slavery ended by 1865, but in the 1850s, the slave power was on the rise. And, militarily, economically, politically, white supremacy was on the rise in the 1850s. By, 1857, the US Supreme Court stated that Black people
Right.
could not be and were not, citizens because they were inferior. But of course, on the other side of that, or around the corner from that, was a different type of, nation, especially as it related to slavery. And so I still have hope, that we could abolish, racism and reconstruct this society in an equitable and just fashion.
Before we started, I said to you off the air that your book is terrific. My kids are 28 and 30, and I wish I had had it about 25 years ago. And I'll reiterate on air, I wish I had had it 25 years ago.
I wish I had it when I first started, parenting and educating too. But I'm so glad How to Raise an Anti-Racist is now out in the world.
I'm so glad it's out. So good to see you. Be well. Hope to see you again soon.
All right. Thank you.
The book again is How to Raise an Anti-Racist.